welcome to Podspective, an initiative by Daitwa Abhiyan. This podcast delves into the values carried by Daitwa, Governance Lab, Nepal Leadership Academy, and Nepal Rising, and discusses themes of governance, leadership, and innovation. This podcast aims to promote sustainable economic development of Nepal and evidence-based policymaking.
नमस्कार सबैजनालाई यहाँहरू सबैलाई यो दायित्व अभियानको पर्सपेक्टिभमा हार्दिक स्वागत छ। आज हामीहरू 16औं श्रृङ्खलामा आइपुगेका छौँ र आज हामीहरू नेपालको विकासको एउटा अत्यन्तै महत्त्वपूर्ण विषयवस्तु राजनैतिक समावेशिता यो बारेमा कुरा गर्न गइरहेका छौँ। We've reached the 16th episode of Perspective by Daitwa Abhiyan, and I'm so delighted that today we will be delving into a very important facet of Nepal's development, political inclusion, and very delighted to welcome our guest, colleague, friend, Soledad, who is also a professor at Stanford University. Welcome, Soledad.
Thanks, Bukar. It's a complete treat to be here.
Yes, lovely. You know, this is the first time we'll be recording this show in English. You know, while, of course, I spent a lot of time in the US, 17 years there. But since coming to Nepal, right, it's been Nepali. And I spent a lot of time in the field. So it's mostly speaking in Nepali. It'll be interesting to be talking in English.
Well, and I appreciate you and everyone else for engaging. You know, pre-COVID, I was spending a lot more time practicing my, I wouldn't say I was ever very good at Nepali, but my Hindi. And, with a few years of a break from travel, I've learned that it all went away. But I got a chance to to go out and do some work in more remote parts of the country earlier this week. And it was amazing how quickly some of the ear came back. So
where did you go?
We went, I'm not going to get the name. A couple hours out of the city. We may end up chatting about this, but just to pilot some survey activities and do some interviews. And it was fun to be able to follow along as local researcher has helped.
Yeah. No, thanks for everything you do in Nepal, Sole. This is adding value. Let's begin with one of the more awkward questions that probably has been thrown at you in these conversations. Who is Soledad Artiz Prillaman, and why is she in the world?
Yeah, it's the big question. Lots of ways to think about answering it. I mean, I think the way that the world sees me is I'm a professor of political science and assistant professor at Stanford University in California. I have spent the last decade of my life doing research and building a portfolio, thinking about political inclusion, particularly women's inclusion in South Asia with projects and research in India, Nepal, and Pakistan. And so I spend so much of my days here in my mind, thinking about studying all of that. And we'll talk, I'm sure, in a second about what the job of a professor actually entails. So that's my work. Maybe transitioning out of that, I think the journey that took me to Stanford, if we work backwards, might reveal a bit more of who I am. And because in some ways I feel that the person I am today on paper, if someone looked at my resume, is very different than how I came into this world. Prior to being at Stanford, I was incredibly privileged to do a postdoc at Oxford. I did my Ph.D. at Harvard. But before all of that, I grew up in Texas, in a very big city in the U.S., Houston, the most diverse city in the country.
Houston,
I am from a family that is, my father is Cuban American, my mother is Lebanese American. And we grew up the first 10 years of my life living on a sailboat. And so I think part of who I am is a little bit of a misfit, a hodgepodge of cultures, of experiences, an adventure. I spent my days as a child sailing around the Gulf of Mexico, and getting to be on the sea, and to this day, the ocean and being connected to nature is something so core and foundational to who I am. But I think also is part of what bred a curiosity to me, something of wanting to see the world, wanting to know what is out there, what more there is, but also in growing up in a household where I am seen by the world as at least in the US, where based on how we define ethnicity, as a Hispanic woman. Though my family comes from both not the typical Hispanic background, being Cuban, but then having a mother who speaks Spanish and raised me in that culture, but is herself Lebanese. I didn't fit in any of the boxes that you typically fit into, and as a student in school, in high school, and so always having to either mask and perform different identities to fit in, but also trying to find my own self. And I think that part of me is what has both led to a curiosity for the world, a compassion for many different ways of existing in this world, but then also not seeing myself as defined by any one thing or set to study or be within just one thing. And I think that's led me to where I am today. We may talk about why it is that I've dedicated my life to the study of South Asia, despite the strange background I've articulated. And I think so much of it is rooted in not wanting to be boxed into one thing, but really seeing the humanity across the whole world. And I think that's come through in my childhood.
Wow. This was so eloquently put together, Sole. I didn't know about some of these backgrounds, but, ordinarily, when someone looks at you, right, they see a professor from Stanford, or they probably see a white person, right? But what we often don't get to know or have conversations about are exactly the things that the foundation for everything that you're doing. And as you talked about everything, the word that was resonating in my mind was your constant quest for freedom.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
So on that note, this journey that you talked about, and you gave us some of the glimpses of it in the waters, right? The sailboat. But as you are sailing through this professional life, this journey, right? You're now in this world of research and political science research. This is in different ways a bit vague as well, right?
Yeah.
Because you're asking questions and the answers, they don't necessarily lead to change immediately, right? And so in your quest for freedom, this process of change takes a long time. So tell us, this journey is difficult, right? This journey is difficult. Why did you pick this? How did you arrive at this?
Yeah, you're very right to hit on the challenges of being in the research and knowledge production profession. Though I think it also is a profession rooted in freedom, getting to see the world without constraint.
Yes.
My goal is to go and just find truths and understand things. And for someone who is curious and seeking freedom, I think that is just a fundamental value and really part of what I love about this job is that, I don't have to be responsive to any particular individual. My job is actually to transcend what others might demand and see truth, even in the face of power, incentives, et cetera. I'm not going to say that's always done or easy, but I think that's part of why I chose this. I think the deeper truth is there are a couple of other components to it. The first is that I entered when I was an undergraduate, thinking about how I wanted to spend my days. development was the core of what I cared about. It was what motivated me. Every class I could take was on development. I think some of that was a desire to get out and see the world, to experience other ways of existing, and to be a part of something bigger that felt like there's growth. I mean, that is the core of, we can debate language, but what development is, it's about trajectory, growth, progress.
Why did you care about that?
I think some of it is just nature. I think that I'm a very empathetic person.
That you are.
And I think that I'm also someone who loves, this is a weird way of putting it, loves people. I love humanity. I like engaging and connecting. And to me, so much of what development is connecting with people in communities and finding ways to sort of make sure everyone is having freedom. And so I at the time, I don't think I had a consciousness around it. It was just the thing that was most inspiring and exciting to me. I mean, in a second, I'll share a little bit more about how some of how I got into this is that my grandfather
Tell us.
Was a political scientist himself who studied India and wrote about he lived in India during independence and partition, and
no wonder you wrote a book on India.
And he has some books on India himself, and so I think some of what bred a curiosity in both development and South Asia is that he passed when I was very young, so I didn't actually get to know him as a person, but I grew up with his stories, with the items he collected. I mean, to this day in my house, I have his furniture that he and my grandmother brought back. My uncle spent the first 5 years of his life in India. So the questions and curiosities that he had found their way into, my bedtime stories and things like that. So I think that's also part of what planted some of these seeds, but also sort of led to a vision for larger opportunities, and that not being constrained to what the world says you're supposed to be or study.
Yeah, no. I mean, now I'm able to understand your cultural DNA even more.
It's a hodgepodge, as I told you.
Yeah. But so as we delve into this word hodgepodge now, if you look at if we look at this, but also then juxtapose this professor at Stanford University, right? What we see oftentimes is this. What we don't see is the hodgepodge, the masking that you talked about, right? And maybe at times having to fit. And maybe at times saying, no, I don't want to fit. Right? So tell us more about this journey, as in what were some of these challenges that you had to sort of blow through in the different identities you described, right? So multiple identities, identity as a woman, identity, your Cuban identity, your Lebanese identity. So all of this, what were some of the challenges that we haven't seen?
Yeah. And, there's so many, and I think something that probably everyone, no matter how, unique or strange your background may seem, encounters, because the world sees us in a particular way, reads our personality in a particular way. But, personally, I think about how, there's so many stories I could tell. I grew up in a part of Houston that was predominantly Hispanic, but where very few of the people from whose families originated in South America or Latin America, were from actually Central America, Mexico and Guatemala and other places like that, and had a very different set of cultural traditions. Everyone there would have a quinceañera when a woman turned 15. And I remember being asked so regularly why I'm not having this. And I'm like, this is not something I grew up understanding. The food we ate was different. And what that meant was that I didn't have access to those communities, the friendship groups, the cliques in school. And part of that is also because, I pass also as very white. And though, something that a lot of people wouldn't see is that if I like travel with my dad, it looks very different. He's treated very differently. And so how I enter the world looks different.
Yeah.
Part of it was also I came from, my family didn't grow up in Texas, and Texans are Texans, deep bred attachment. So I was like a first generation Texan, which meant that we'll talk about political inclusion, but my family came from a political party that was very different than what was around. So again, I sort of had to hide my political beliefs. I'm hiding what food I'm eating. I mean, when I met my husband very young, and when I went to have dinner at his house, it was like the first time I had like sweet tea, which is a typical Southern drink that you would just have with every meal. And they were just astonished and shocked. And it was a moment of like cultural revelation. Who are you as a person if you don't know this? So I think there was a lot of that in early years where I hid so many parts of my identity as I navigated through the world. But I don't think stopped even then. I think it became even more obvious to me when I went to grad school, when I started a Ph.D., where because of a desire for inclusion, and I don't think these are bad things, so none of this is with judgment attached, but I was immediately classified as a Hispanic woman, which is an underrepresented background. And the question it was just assumed that I would study South America. There was no question about this. It was who I was assigned as advisors, what classes I was expected to take. You speak Spanish, you're from the region, you must want to do this. And that was frustrating to me, both as someone who, as you, I think, so eloquently articulated, has a desire for freedom, but also as someone who hadn't seen myself in that way, in part because I can't study Cuba. Like, if we really want to think about where, like, studying the place that you come from, I'm not allowed to step foot in Cuba. There are like heavy restrictions on travel. There is no political science in Cuba. You're not allowed to collect data. And so it would be impossible for me to actually do what I do studying the country that my family originates from. And so really what they were saying is you must then share an identity with this whole part of the world. And therefore that must be what you want to be. And I remember meeting so many people in grad school saying, I'm going to go to India because that's where I started and I want to go study this. And they said, you should absolutely not do this. You will never make it. You won't. It's going to be too different. You're not going to find your way. And, having in the face of all of this to both mask your desires, your beliefs in the way that you interact with people, but also remain resilient and confident in yourself that, no, I'm going to defy the odds. That's not an easy thing to do. And there were so many days where I questioned that. And I'm grateful that I think I was somewhat naive and just, pushed through.
Of course. Yes.
But there's a lot of challenge, I think, in so much of the world, but in particular in academia and in research, we really like putting things into boxes and segmenting them. And I think, which is a little bit at odds with the endeavor.
Yeah. No, as I was thinking about like how this process has been a lot about hiding, finding, framing. And I think you're right. I think, you're driven so much with curiosity that, that naivete is a good thing. Then you uncover new things about yourself and the topics. So a bit into now, what the type of research that you do, right? And so you've already talked about how you always wanted to and started your research journey in India. You spent a good amount there, no?
Yeah, I've spent a few years on and off.
Right. So now we know why you picked India in many different ways. An important part of your research is gender, right?
Yep.
And political inclusion, right? So tell us more about this. How has your research changed over the years? So from when you began wanting to go on this journey to now, and then zooming into a country, how has that been?
Yeah, it's been a journey itself. And, we can start from the naive version of myself that went straight from undergraduate into a Ph.D. I'd never lived anywhere outside of Texas. I show up in Boston saying, I'm going to go study elsewhere in the world. I didn't come from a family where travel was something we did a lot of. And so I hadn't actually stepped foot in India, despite saying this is what I want to do. And motivated by questions of development more broadly. At the time, and this has come through in my work, and I'm happy to talk about this. At the time, this was the moment where microfinance was really getting a lot of attention and was being seen as a path to development. I'd spent a lot of time as an undergraduate learning the model of microfinance. And so I went into grad school saying, I want to study the politics of microfinance. We know about the economics of it, but I want to understand, how does this change politics in communities? How does it create or change constituencies? That was the question that guided me, which of course also lent itself to studying South Asia, sort of where this concept emerged from. And so I went to, I went to India for a few months one summer with this as a goal. And I attribute so much of my capacity to doing that to someone that is now a close colleague, but was a mentor at the time, who I work with in Nepal as well, Rohini Pandey. But I showed up in her office out of the blue one day. And despite at Harvard, and despite having just met me, she said, well, you want to go to India? And I said, yes. And she said, okay, I have an office there. We'll get you to India this summer. And so that was, I think, a transformative moment in my professional life and life in general. So it wasn't all personally fought. I had some opportunities. And so I went for the summer, based in her office, working on a project.
Which year was this?
This was in 2014. 2013 or 2014.
Yeah, almost a bit more than a decade ago.
A bit more than a decade ago, exactly. And I was working with her on a project that I've continued and is still a passion around youth employment and the role of vocational training in that. But while I was doing that, as part of what helped me enter the research space in India, I was also pursuing my own passion and interest in this question around the politics of microfinance. And I'm based in Delhi, and I sent out no less than 100 emails to different organizations that engage in microfinance, just asking to talk to people. And in that process, I got connected to an NGO that ended up being transformative for my intellectual career. And I wrote a book with them, working with them in partnership, which we can talk about at some point. But on my journey, what happened was I went to the field and I started observing what they did, just trying to learn, what does this look like? And this was both that summer, but then in subsequent visits, I came back every few months for more time, and I would go back and visit the work this NGO was doing. And what they were doing was mobilizing self-help groups, these groups of women that served as microcredit groups, but had clearly more that they were doing in the world. And that's what I was trying to understand. This group that is meant to be economic, what else is happening? But to zoom out for a second, what it revealed to me when I just started going and talking to these women was both the fundamental link between development and gender, how I was asking people to take me to microfinance groups. I didn't actually think about gender when I was showing up. It was thrust upon me because of the nature of the way that we have designed so many development interventions, the way microfinance is designed. But then also, as I was talking to these women, realizing that understanding their political lives, seeing them as political beings, political citizens, and trying to get a framework to understand their political lives so that then we could even imagine how different interventions might change that, that we don't have an existing framework. We didn't have a framework for how to think about when do women have political power? When do women as citizens have political access? All of the models that we had in academia were rooted in the US, rooted in the West. And so how can I both engage in local research, but also like take that as a big question? And that became, after sort of a year of just, we have this term in academia called soaking and poking. So after a year of just soaking up what the world had to show me, revealed to me what has now become my life's mission, which is understanding the challenges to political inclusion for women, but marginalized communities more generally. And once we understand what those challenges are, how can we design levers to alleviate those and yield a more inclusive politics? And so that's the journey of how I got to
That's wonderful.
where I am.
That's wonderful. No. This is interesting because you went in there with Rohini thinking about a set of questions that made sense for EPOD, Harvard, and then you had another set of questions. And then how over time you've arrived at sort of the mission of your professional life is very interesting. So, we'll talk more about the nuances of the different aspects of this political inclusion, but maybe tell us what does, and maybe this is also in your book, The Patriarchal Political Order, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this is also in your book. What does the North Star look like? What does the North Star of political inclusion look like? What can one imagine happening in South Asia or in India or in Nepal? And so we would be saying, okay, good, we've arrived. Is there something like that?
What is, normatively speaking, what is it that we're striving for?
Wow.
And I would even go so far as to say, what are we striving for in the world? Because I think very few places have achieved what I'm about to suggest. And something we can talk about later is the fact that there is no society in the world that is not a patriarchy, and which is really frustrating as an academic. You need variation to study a thing, so there's no variation in this. But what is it that we're striving for? I think the way that the world has seen it, which I think is a part of the answer, is equality of outcomes. So equal representation, equal engagement, women showing up in political spaces, whether that's, we often think about that as elected leaders. Do we have enough women in elected office? But I think that it is as important, if not more important, to think of that at lower levels. Do women citizens show up in political forums at the same rate? Do they make demands on their local leaders or on their state at the same rate? Do they vote? All of these different ways that politics intersects with daily life. Do we see equality in engagement, in outcomes of those things?
And political outcomes.
Political outcomes. And by that, I think... by that, I mean political participation. So engagement in political processes.
Yes.
With the expectation that, which I guess we're going to start to get to maybe the other parts of this. Yeah. So the expectation that engagement in political institutions means that there's equal voice in those institutions, that what women articulate is heard with as much authority and is then reflected in the decisions that those political institutions make with equal opportunity. And so I think that's another big part of it, a part that I think we haven't put quite as much focus on. We've spent a lot of time of trying to get women's seats at the table, but having a seat at the table does not mean influence, voice, authority. It doesn't mean you're sitting at the head of the table. Right. It doesn't mean you're talking as much. And so I think that is also what I think of with political inclusion. And the last thing I would add to this that I think is really fundamental to how I think of what's underlying both of those things is agency. And, really to go back to where we started, freedom, that women as citizens, women as representatives have the equal ability and opportunity to voice their demands, to do so without fear, without threats of coercion, without fear that they will be sanctioned in some way. That one of the things that I've spent a long time studying and thinking about in India, but have also been now studying in Nepal, is how much it is that men exert influence over who women vote for. But it doesn't always go in the same direction. In fact, I have some data from India where I surveyed every single adult in about 20 villages, and which amounts to tens of thousands of people. And I asked each of them, so every person from every family, every adult, and I asked them, who do you discuss politics with? And because I've surveyed everyone, I know if they tell me your name, I can match that to your characteristics. I know who you have told me. And when you look at the graph of political discussion, just talking about politics by gender, what you see is that 99% of the people with whom men discuss politics, say they discuss politics, are other men outside of their homes. But when you look at women, it's about 50-50 in terms of political discussion in the home and out of the home. So about 50% of the people they discuss politics with are their friends outside of the home, most of whom are women. But about half the people they discuss politics with are people in their home. And of those people in their home, many of them, most of them, are the men in their home. And so what we see, I think what's hidden behind that fact is that because I've talked to all of the same people, naming the same people, women are saying they're talking to the men in their homes about politics. Men do not think they're talking to the women in their homes about politics. So they don't see the women in their homes as political agents that are influencing their behavior, whereas women do. And to me, that gets to some of the core parts of agency, the assumptions that women deserve the same opportunities, the same agency, the same authority in these decisions. And I think only when you have that will you see representation and seats at the table then reflected in voice.
Yes. Oh, this is so interesting. So it's almost like socialization of your political beliefs, no? In some ways.
Yes.
Because men, are not treating women as equals. B, are influencing the way they maybe vote.
Yes.
Right? They exercise their votes, because that's one of the things that you talk about in your book, right?
Yeah.
The question was, so you see so many women going out to vote, but you see very few women in political powers.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So then the question also becomes, a lot of the times when we look at outcomes, we're looking at where women are not or are, right, in the world of politics. But then, as we try to understand this aspect, are we looking a lot more at the trees and not the forest, right? Because then there is the whole social aspect to all of this, right? How you get brainwashed, or what is happening. So then, how do you reconcile all of this, and what does this mean, in terms of what we need to do to ensure this equality, this world of equality of outcomes that you talked about?
Yeah, this is such an important question. I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start with an anecdote, or not an anecdote, but a story from the U.S. So in the recent elections that we just had last year in the U.S., one of the campaign ads that the Harris campaign fielded shows a bunch of women going to the ballot box. And as they're talking to each other in the ballot box, they're saying, you don't have to vote for who your husband tells you to vote for. Like, we can do it in the U.S. This was an ad run on national television, and like suggesting you can you can choose whoever you want in this room. You don't have to listen to what he's saying. And, the implicit assumption underlying that is that there's fear, there's pressure, there's dominance happening in the household that then persists in the way that people engage in politics. And I think, this is one of the things that I showed operates in India, as well, more generally. And so zooming out from this story, I think what it highlights is what you're talking about so intensively. Gender power structures that we can see when we look at political outcomes exist in every institution we exist in, at its most fundamental in the household as an institution. And that, I think, makes gender inclusion one of the hardest things to think about. When we think about other identities, racial identities or religion, language, culture, these are often things that are shared at the household level. Everyone in the household tends to come from the same group. And so that we see sort of the stop of those power structures in our homes. But that's not true for gender more generally. And so it creates a challenge to then it means that you have to fight, even in the most personal of your lives and the spaces you exist in, for authority and for those rights. And it also means that fear and pressure can come in those most intimate of relationships. But in terms of seeing the forest for the trees or the trees for the forest, I think part of what this means is that there's often a desire when it comes to gender inclusion to find a silver bullet. To find a solution that means we will have achieved gender equality. I think we see this at all levels. It's how do we get women out to vote? How do we get women into elected office? Things like quotas have become more than 130 countries in the world have quotas for women in elected office. If you really think about it, that's it has to be the biggest political empowerment intervention in the world. More than half of the world is engaging in this kind of institution building. And I think that there are incredible benefits to that, and we can talk about those. But I think it also focuses on a single Band-Aid or a single solution to it. And yet, this is an issue that is so deeply entrenched in every power structure we exist in. And I think what that means is that it is to achieve political inclusion or gender inclusion more generally, gender equality more generally, we have to see it as a systemic problem that I often think of it as a game of whack-a-mole where, you can get one of the moles down, but something else is going to pop up because the pervasiveness of these social power structures mean that there are a lot of opportunities to fight back against change. And maybe that's where the politics of this also comes in. When we think about economics, there's often an opportunity that you can lift, rising tides lift all boats. And so if you can get development, solved the issues of development, everyone will be better off. I think fundamentally that gender inclusion also has that effect. But when we think just about power itself, it is more finite. There are only so many seats in parliament. Only so, a party will win at the end of the day, or there's only so much in a budget that can be allocated across policies. And so the challenge to political inclusion is finding a way to fundamentally transform power structures and provide to reallocate some of the authority that's been there. And that's not going to be easy. The people who've had power will fight back. And that's where I think sometimes the focus on a silver bullet loses the forest actually for the trees.
And that is a big question even in Nepal now, right? Because we have the quotas, and we have 33% women in the federal parliament, provincial parliament, but is there that, have we arrived at the North Star? How you describe things, and the question is, no, we haven't. There's a lot of work to be done. So then, while this may sound, a bit, I will pose it sensitively, but it's sort of a difficult question, which is, if quotas are a silver bullet, possibly, because that's what's happening everywhere. So it's sort of an isomorphic mimicry, right? In some ways. What are some other alternatives? What have we seen work in different parts of the world?
Yeah, I think, if I can maybe reframe a little bit,
please.
I don't know that I see it as alternatives.
Yeah.
I see it as additions.
Yes. Okay, good.
And I think, because I think quotas serve an incredibly important purpose.
Yeah, because they were not there.
They were not there. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really foundational about quotas, particularly quotas like what we see in Nepal that are ingrained in the constitution, is that these are institutions that are not easy to change. The country has made a commitment to political inclusion and has done so with a Sharpie, with a permanent marker. And I think that is a huge step forward, and something that was fought hard for in this country by many different constituencies and parties. Parties meaning more generally like people groups. And I think we don't observe that kind of institutional strength in other contexts. Like in the US, we don't have institutionalized quotas, and that means that has consequences for how easy it is to undo progress.
Which maybe we are seeing now.
Which we might be seeing, and we should chat about. And why I think that means that Nepal is on a different trajectory because it has invested in building these institutions. And so while quotas may not be the silver bullet, they provide the foundation for building a house.
Yes.
And if we see them that way, then we can think about what additional building materials do we need to layer on. Sure. And so when I think about so then to answer your question, well, what has worked elsewhere? I think this is the place the world is at right now. So I actually I think there's a lot to be learned. I think for a long time, over the last 20 years, so much of the research that we've seen came out about all of the positive effects of quotas, particularly the early 2000s. It was just, this is a transformative institution, which it is for the reasons we've talked about. It takes what was barren land and lays a foundation. But more recently, what research is starting to show is how both quotas are imperfect in solving. They haven't taken us to the North Star. That's true in Nepal, and I've done some work, and others have as well, to show that. But it's true across the globe. So they don't fully get you to the North Star, but then on top of it, they aren't impervious to cracks and to rain and to landslides and all the things that can break a foundation down. And so I think the question that we're at both in academia and I think in the policy world is what more is needed. And so I don't know that there's a lot I can say about what we have learned directly layers onto these, but I think we can take some learnings of what things do seem to matter as a starting point of thinking about what policies work. And one thing, a few things that I think deeply about. So the first is that quotas are a top-down institution. They're imposed from above. They set rules, and then people follow those rules. But, in democracies like Nepal, there is the core of democracy is about accountability to the bottom. And so bottom-up demand. And so I think alongside this, we need to think very carefully about the role that citizens are playing in the political process. Are women citizens being included? Do these quotas that protect women's rights at the table coincide with accountability to female constituents who are demanding that change, demanding inclusion of women? And if not, what is needed to ensure that women citizens have the right? This is part of what motivated my book. India has a quota system that's been in place for a long time, and yet you see huge gender gaps in citizens' ability to engage in the system. And so how can we expect women leaders to be a silver bullet if they're responsive to the same political dynamics men are responsive to? And so these are strategic, incredibly smart women. And so they're going to do what's in their best interest to sort of remain in power, to achieve their goals. We shouldn't just assume that they're just going to altruistically represent women. And so if instead you have collective action, sort of movements among women that demand change, it makes it much easier for these
Right.
institutions to achieve their aim. And so that's one thing that I would say needs to really be thought about is how do we link the top down with the bottom up? And then the other is how do we protect the top? How do we think about what are the challenges to the authority that these women leaders have? And how are those challenges, how do we protect and insulate women from that?
Yeah.
And this is seen across the world. The amount of, as political leaders, the amount of violence that women politicians face is significantly greater than the amount of violence that male leaders
And
encounter.
we're seeing that in South Asia a lot.
Exactly. And so that's a very obvious challenge. Like if you're afraid for your life, if you're afraid for, how can you govern effectively? But then of course there's more there's more sort of insidious challenges that exist where, one of the things that I've studied in the Indian context is how male family members continue to exert power over their wives and mothers and daughter-in-laws who are the elected officials, but they end up sort of having a lot of the authority to dictate how they govern in a way that is not true when men are the elected officials. So how do we provide women leaders with, it's not about capability or aspirations or desires. These women have as much desire for power. In fact, higher desire for power. It's that they face a set of structural constraints, societal constraints.
Access to phones. Who picks up the phone?
Exactly.
When you call a mayor who's a female, right?
We found, I haven't done this in Nepal, but in India, in less than 50% of cases does the woman pick up the phone when she's the elected leader.
Exactly.
And it's not even just, we did a measurement tool where we went into about 1,000 villages and we sent a team of surveyors to just go talk to citizens and say, we are coming here to do a survey in this village. We need to get permission from the mayor, the sarpanch in India. Who should we talk to? Who is the person we should go to? And in more than 60% of cases, they sent us to the husband. And so it's not, it's a norm that has to be challenged, a norm that women don't deserve the same authority. And so we also need to think about how do we protect that authority? How do we provide both the resources, phones, money, which is often unequally distributed when labor force participation is unequally distributed, access to connections and networks, because often the bureaucracy is filled with men, it's at every level. But then also, how do we think about the cultural change of what would it take for people to believe that women are as capable as they actually are? And I think those are the challenges. And now it's a question of figuring out what the solutions are.
Yeah, no. This is great. So I think I saw you talk about two threads, right? In sort of if quotas are the Sharpie, what are the sign pens, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So then you talked about, how collective action at the grassroots level, engaging women and men in that shared journey can create an environment, a larger environment. And so that can possibly also address the socialization aspect. And you also talked about how do you protect the environment where these women now need to perform, right? So now they're there. The second half of the mountain still exists, which is often harder. And so what type of environment do we need to create? Something that we haven't touched upon yet, and you mentioned this, you mentioned the word money.
Yeah.
Right? So, as you know, Daitwa does a lot of work around women's economic empowerment at the grassroots level. So accelerating women enterprises to, earn more, create jobs. And, as I've, worked in supporting these enterprises, but now more so also in working with women politicians, I often hear women politicians talk about access to money, talk about, access to money to win elections and to do the things they need to do after winning those elections, right? And so what relationship now then you see between, economic empowerment and political empowerment, and what remains to be done in this world of economy that hopefully can lay a better environment for women to excel in politics.
Yeah. Such an important question. And I think highlights something we talked about earlier, which is how the challenge for gender inclusion is that the different systems of gender inequality intersect to reinforce each other. Yeah. I think there are a couple things I would say to this. So many of the models that we have, largely from the global north, in thinking about women's political inclusion, political equality, are rooted in the concept of economic empowerment. The assumption being if women can gain equal economic footing, then they can gain equal political footing. And, it's honestly how I even showed up, that first summer in India. And, a lot of people, one of the things that I studied was the impact of microfinance on political behavior. And a first question I get is, well, how much of it is just the money they got? And so my answer is twofold. On the one hand, I think that is an incomplete narrative that, and I'll come back to this because I'm not saying that economic empowerment doesn't matter, not even close to that, but that I think the assumption that you have to have economic empowerment to have political empowerment is not fully borne out in evidence. I think a lot of that comes back to collective action and the power of numbers as an alternative strategy to the power of dollars. And so one of the things that I've observed is that women, even when they are economically disadvantaged, can make big moves and demand representation and find access to politics when they are able to leverage their collective strength, which often comes from the fundamental grievance of being economically disempowered. It's something that unites women. And so I think that's the first thing I would say is that it's important to remember that we can make traction on the issue of political inclusion, even for women who don't have all of the same access to resources, who aren't in the labor force, who don't have the same money. It's not hopeless for those women.
Sure.
And I think South Asia in particular provides us with the strongest examples of women making change and raising their voices in the face of some of the most extreme economic inequalities. That said, I also think that fundamentally changing these systems in tandem is going to have incredible effects. We know that labor force participation is one of the strongest correlates of women's political participation. And that's in part because having access to jobs, which is both money and all the other resources that come from being in the workforce, give women more opportunities, more agency, more ability to fight for what they want, to know that they can fight for what they want, to advocate for themselves. We also know on the leader side, running campaigns is expensive. Convincing voters that you have the capacity to manage budgets and run the enterprise that is politics often requires money. And so we do know that access to financial resources is a critical challenge that women face when engaging in politics. And so to me, I think some of the best hope for the future is in younger generations, filling those economic gaps to see then how political gaps close in response. And I think it's both money and education. And again, I think both of these things are more than just skills and money. It's about your beliefs over what you're entitled to, your ability to negotiate for power. It's what comes with money and education internally and externally. But I also don't know that I think it's completely enough, that money alone won't convince people that you are equal. And so having additional, seeing that as one of the pens you'd bring to the table, but you'd still need a few other colors, is part of how I think of the relationship between the two.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I was in a panel, and this is organized by an organization called Women Lead, and they are trying to, develop a cadre of young women politicians, right? And so they asked me, what should I do now at this phase of my life? Should it be about making money so that when I run for politics, I don't have to worry about this? Or should it be about politics, because I need to understand those issues and gain legitimacy before it becomes late? It seems like the latter, the second one, is the preferred route, because there's so much pain. You want to jump into this. And I didn't know how to answer this. But what I'm hearing what you say is, maybe either ways, you need to be ready. You need to be emotionally ready, right? And that's more important. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think that, the fact that this is a question is something like that question that was posed to you is something I think women are more likely to ask than men, because so much is demanded of women.
Very true.
And so in some ways, there's also this fundamental challenge of you have to be so much more as a woman to make it through all of these hurdles. And yet it feels impossible at times to do that. But I think, what my conclusion of this would be that there is not a single path that a woman can take. There's so many challenges and opportunities to shine. And something maybe we can talk about in a second is about some work about how women who do get elected to office are typically of substantially higher quality than the men who get elected. And I think it's because you have to be so much more to get there. But I think it means that there are both opportunities, so long as you, if your ultimate goal is to get in politics, that, you use the resources that you're building to help you continue to work towards that goal. Money alone, without connections, without knowledge of constituents, without platforms, without an understanding of the various institutions that serve as gatekeepers, parties, et cetera, won't be enough. But also having those connections, being in a senior member of an institution or a party may not be enough if you don't have the money. And so it's about both identifying my guess, well, maybe what I would say to a woman who shared with me is it's, both what is your strengths and what do you need to develop as your challenges, but also what is your passions? And, it's as with most of these professions, I feel like academia is very similar. It's a long haul. It's a marathon. And so what path will lead you to be resilient in the face of that marathon? And there is no do this and you will get there, but do what feels good to you.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.